On a frosty winter morning, Richard Hawthorne stood in front of his wardrobe, surveying the rows of expensive suits and jackets that reflected his success. Among the luxurious fabrics, his hand paused on an old wool coat, frayed at the edges and worn thin from years of use. It was a relic from a time long past, a period of his life that he had neatly compartmentalized and pushed aside. Without much thought, he pulled it off the hanger, feeling the rough texture beneath his fingertips. The memories it evoked were distant, barely more than a whisper in the back of his mind. Without hesitation, he tossed the coat into a donation bag, ready to part with the remnants of his former self. As he moved through his morning routine, the coat became just another item in a pile of things he no longer needed. Richard prided himself on his efficiency, on his ability to streamline his life to focus on what truly mattered: his career, his investments, his reputation. The coat, now discarded, was merely a symbol of a time when life was less certain, less controlled. He zipped up the bag and left it by the door, ready for the charity service to pick it up later that day. For him, it was a simple act of decluttering, of making room for the new, without realizing he was discarding more than just fabric. Later that afternoon, as Richard sat in his office, the coat was collected along with other donations and taken away to an unknown destination. Richard was engrossed in his work, his mind far from the small act of charity he had performed. The world of high-stakes business was where he thrived, where every decision had a calculated purpose. But as the day wore on, a subtle unease settled over him, a nagging feeling that he couldn't quite place. It was as though something important had slipped through his fingers, though he quickly brushed the thought aside, attributing it to the pressures of his busy schedule. The coat, now out of sight, began its journey through the city, passing through the hands of various people who never knew the man who once owned it. Each transfer added a layer of distance between Richard and the object he had discarded, yet something of him remained stitched into its fabric. The coat had seen him through difficult times, had been a silent witness to his struggles and triumphs. But to Richard, it was just another item to be rid of, another piece of the past he had no intention of revisiting. Little did he know that this coat, seemingly insignificant, was about to resurface in his life in a way he could never have anticipated. As night fell, Richard returned to his penthouse, the events of the day already blurring into the routine of his well-ordered life. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and stared out at the city lights, his thoughts far from the old coat he had discarded that morning. The feeling of unease had faded, replaced by the familiar comfort of success and the knowledge that he was in control of his destiny. Yet, somewhere in the city, the coat was weaving its way back into his life, carrying with it the echoes of a past that Richard had long tried to forget. The wheels of fate had been set in motion, and there was no turning back. Unbeknownst to Richard, the coat had already found a new owner, a young man named Leo, who would soon become a key player in the unraveling of Richard's carefully constructed life. For Leo, the coat was a blessing, a shield against the biting cold of the winter streets. He had no idea of the history it carried, nor of the man who had once worn it. But as he wrapped it around himself, he felt a strange connection, as if the coat had a story to tell, one that was waiting to be uncovered. In that moment, the lives of Richard and Leo were unknowingly intertwined by a simple piece of clothing. Richard slept soundly that night, unaware that the past he had tried so hard to distance himself from was about to come crashing back into his life. The coat, now out of his hands, was on a path that would lead it right back to him, bringing with it memories and emotions he had buried long ago. It would force him to confront the choices he had made and the person he had become. But for now, Richard remained blissfully ignorant, cocooned in the security of his wealth and success, believing that the past was firmly behind him. The discarded coat, worn and tattered, was more than just an old piece of clothing. It was a vessel of memories, of forgotten promises and lost love. Richard, in his quest for success, had shed these memories like old skin, but the coat had retained them, holding on to the fragments of a life he no longer acknowledged. As it moved through the city, it carried with it the weight of those forgotten days, ready to reveal its secrets to a new owner. Richard's life, once so carefully curated, was about to be thrown into turmoil by the very thing he had thought so insignificant. As the dawn of a new day approached, the stage was set for the reunion of Richard and his past, with the coat as the silent witness to the unfolding drama. The journey of the coat, from the back of Richard's wardrobe to the streets of the city, was more than just a physical journey. It was a passage through time, a bridge between what was and what could have been. Richard's decision to discard the coat had unknowingly set off a chain of events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself. The coat, now in Leo's possession, was about to become the catalyst for a profound transformation in both their lives. The following day, as Richard strolled through the bustling streets of the city, his mind preoccupied with the demands of his day, something caught his eye. Across the street, a young man huddled against the cold, wearing a coat that Richard immediately recognized. It was the same old wool coat he had discarded just the day before. For a moment, Richard was struck by the coincidence, his steps slowing as he took in the sight. The young man, Leo, seemed lost in thought, his hands tucked into the deep pockets of the coat as he sought warmth against the biting wind. Leo, unaware of the man observing him from a distance, felt a small sense of comfort as he tightened the coat around his thin frame. The city was an unforgiving place, especially in winter, and for someone like Leo, who had seen better days, the coat was a blessing. It wasn't just the warmth it provided, but the strange sense of security it offered, as though it were a shield against the harshness of the world. He had found the coat at a local charity, never imagining it had once belonged to a man like Richard, whose life seemed worlds apart from his own. Richard couldn't shake the feeling of satisfaction that bloomed in his chest as he watched Leo. It was a rare moment of human connection for a man who often kept himself at a distance from others. The coat, which had once been a mere object to him, now seemed to carry more significance. It was as though, in some small way, he had made a difference in someone's life. Richard continued walking, but the image of Leo stayed with him, a reminder of the simple act of giving that had led to this unexpected encounter. As Leo made his way through the city, the coat did more than just shield him from the cold. It became a symbol of hope, a reminder that life could still offer small mercies even in the bleakest of times. The warmth of the coat was like a silent promise, one that encouraged Leo to keep moving forward, to keep searching for a way out of his current situation. He didn't know it, but the coat carried with it the echoes of a life much like his own. A life that had once been filled with struggle and uncertainty before it found its way into the lap of luxury. The streets were busy, filled with the sounds of honking cars and the murmur of countless conversations. But for Leo, the world had narrowed down to the warmth of the coat and the path ahead. He had no idea that Richard, the man who had once worn the coat, was just a few blocks away, continuing his own journey through life. The city, vast and indifferent, had unknowingly woven their stories together with the threads of this simple garment. The connection was invisible, but it was there, binding them in ways neither could yet understand. As the day wore on, Leo found himself reflecting on the coat and the unexpected gift it had become. It wasn't just the comfort it provided, but the sense of dignity it restored in him. For the first time in a long while, Leo felt like he could face the world with his head held high, the coat serving as a reminder that he was still worthy of warmth and care. The world had been cruel, but in this small act of charity, Leo found a glimmer of kindness that reignited a spark of hope within him. Richard, meanwhile, continued with his day, The image of Leo fading into the background as meetings and deadlines took precedence. Yet, a small part of him kept returning to that moment, to the sight of his old coat on someone else's shoulders. It was a fleeting connection, but it stirred something in him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Perhaps it was the realization that the things we discard without a second thought can find new life in the hands of others. Or perhaps it was simply the human need to feel connected, even in the smallest of ways. As night fell once again, both men went about their lives, unaware that this was only the beginning of a journey that would bring them together in ways neither could have predicted. The coat, once discarded as useless, had already begun to change the course of their lives. For Leo, it was a lifeline in a sea of despair, a sign that perhaps things could get better. For Richard, it was a reminder of the things he had left behind in his pursuit of success, things he hadn't realized he still cared about until that moment. The city continued to pulse with life, indifferent to the stories unfolding within it. But for Richard and Leo, this was the start of something new, something that would challenge their understanding of value and connection. The coat was more than just an object now. It was a thread that tied them together, a thread that would lead them down a path of self-discovery and transformation. The journey had begun, and neither man could foresee the profound impact this unexpected gift would have on their lives. Leo had spent several days wearing the coat, finding solace in its warmth as he navigated the cold city streets. One evening, as he sat on a park bench, trying to gather his thoughts, he absent-mindedly ran his fingers along the inside of the coat. Something caught his attention, a slight irregularity in the lining. Intrigued, he carefully examined the spot, noticing a small, almost invisible seam. With growing curiosity, he gently pried it open, his heart quickening as he felt something tucked away inside. His fingers closed around a piece of paper, and with a mixture of anticipation and unease, he pulled it out. The paper was old, the edges yellowed and frayed, and as Leo unfolded it, he saw that it was a note, written in a delicate, flowing script. The words were faded but still legible, and as he began to read, a sense of unease settled over him. The note was addressed to someone dear, someone who had once meant the world to the writer. It spoke of love, of promises made and broken, and of a deep yearning to reconnect. The emotions conveyed in the note were raw and sincere, and Leo could almost feel the weight of the writer's longing as he read on. It was clear that this was not just any note. It held a significance that Leo couldn't yet fully grasp. Leo read the note again, slower this time, letting the words sink in. It was clear that this message had been carefully hidden, perhaps forgotten over the years. But why? And who had written it? The name at the bottom of the note was unfamiliar to him, but there was something about the tone, the emotions expressed, that struck a chord deep within him. He couldn't shake the feeling that this note was important, that it held a story that needed to be told. For a moment, he considered dismissing it as a relic of the past, something that no longer held relevance. But something inside him told him otherwise. The more Leo thought about it, the more he felt compelled to do something with the note. It was as if the coat had chosen him, had brought him this message for a reason. The note spoke of a time when love had been pure, when promises were meant to be kept, and the world was simpler. Leo couldn't help but wonder what had happened to the person who wrote it, and whether they ever found the closure they sought. The thought of someone out there, waiting for a response that never came, weighed heavily on him. He knew he had to find out more, to uncover the story behind this forgotten message. Leo's life had been marked by hardship, by moments of despair where he felt the world had forgotten him. But now, with the note in his possession, he felt a spark of purpose igniting within him. It was a small thing, a fragile piece of paper, but it carried with it the weight of someone else's story, someone who had once experienced love and loss in ways that Leo could barely imagine. He knew that finding the original owner of the coat might be a long shot, but he also knew that he couldn't just walk away from this. There was something here, something that felt almost like destiny. The city around him seemed to fade into the background as Leo sat there, turning the note over in his hands. He thought about the man who had discarded the coat, wondering if he was the one who had written the note or if it had been meant for him. The questions swirled in his mind, each one more pressing than the last. Leo wasn't sure where to start, but he knew he had to try. The note had found its way to him, and he felt a responsibility to see this through, to uncover the truth behind the words written so long ago. As he sat there, the cold biting at his fingers, Leo made a decision. He would find the man who had owned the coat, the man who had once been so close to the writer of this note. He would track him down, return the note, and hopefully bring some closure to a story that had been left unfinished for too long. It was a daunting task, especially for someone in his situation, but Leo felt a determination he hadn't felt in years. The note had given him a purpose, and he wasn't going to let that slip away. With renewed resolve, Leo stood up from the bench, the note safely tucked back into the coat's lining. He didn't have much to go on, just a name and the vague sense that this was important, but he had learned to trust his instincts, and they were telling him that this was the right thing to do. As he walked away from the park, the city lights reflecting off the snow-covered streets, he felt a sense of anticipation growing within him. This was the beginning of something new, a journey that would take him places he never expected to go. Leo didn't know it yet, but the note would not only lead him to the man who had discarded the coat, but also to a deeper understanding of his own life. The words written on that fragile piece of paper would become a catalyst for change, for both him and Richard. And as Leo set off into the night, he couldn't help but feel that somehow, in some strange way, the coat had brought them together for a reason. The note had waited years to be found, and now that it had, it was about to change everything. With the note securely tucked in the lining of the coat, Leo felt a newfound sense of purpose guiding his steps. Each day that passed, he became more determined to uncover the story behind the note, to find the man who had once owned the coat and deliver the message that had been hidden for so long. The streets of the city, once cold and indifferent, now seemed to hold clues and possibilities at every corner. Leo began to ask questions, to search for any lead that could connect him to the man who had been so important to the note's writer. It was as if his own life had taken on new meaning through this quest. As Leo's search deepened, he found himself reflecting on his own past, the struggles he had faced, and the choices that had led him to where he was. The note had stirred something within him, a reminder of the dreams and hopes he once had before life had hardened him. The city had a way of wearing people down, of making them forget who they were and what they wanted out of life. But now, with this mission before him, Leo felt a renewed sense of identity, a connection to something greater than himself. It was as if he had been given a second chance, not just to help someone else, but to rediscover his own humanity. As the days turned into weeks, Leo's journey took him to places he had never been before. He visited old libraries, searching through public records, talked to people in charity shops, and even wandered through neighborhoods far from his own, hoping to catch a glimpse of the man he sought. Each step he took felt like a step closer to the truth, though the path was often fraught with dead ends and frustrations. Yet, Leo persevered, driven by the feeling that this was his destiny, that he had been chosen to carry out this task. The coat, once just a source of warmth, had become a symbol of his mission, a constant reminder of the story he was trying to piece together. During this time, Richard began to notice a growing sense of unease within himself. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, that there was a part of his life he had overlooked in his pursuit of success. The image of the young man wearing his old coat often came to mind, bringing with it a vague sense of regret. Richard's life, though filled with material wealth, began to feel hollow, as if the things he had once valued were no longer enough. He found himself thinking more and more about the past, about the choices he had made and the people he had left behind. The coat had been a part of that past, and now it seemed to be calling him back to it. Leo's journey was not just about finding the man who had owned the coat. It was also about finding himself. The more he searched, the more he realized that this mission was as much about his own redemption as it was about delivering the note. He began to confront the demons of his past, the mistakes he had made, and the opportunities he had let slip away. The city, which had once felt like a prison, now seemed to offer him a way out, a chance to rewrite his story. The coat, with its hidden message, had become a beacon of hope, guiding him toward a future he hadn't dared to dream of. Richard, on the other hand, found himself retreating into memories he had long buried. The coat had been with him during a time when life was simpler, when love and hope had seemed within reach. But as he had climbed the ladder of success, he had left those things behind, believing that they were distractions from his goals. Now, with the image of Leo and the coat haunting his thoughts, Richard began to wonder if he had made the right choices. The life he had built, though impressive on the surface, suddenly seemed fragile, as if it could crumble under the weight of his unacknowledged past. As Leo's search continued, he started to see connections where there had once been none. The city, vast and sprawling, began to feel like a small place where everyone's lives were intertwined in ways they couldn't fully understand. Leo began to realize that his own journey was connected to Richard's in ways he hadn't anticipated. The note, with its words of love and regret, seemed to echo his own thoughts and feelings, as if it had been written for him as much as for the man who had originally owned the coat. Leo began to feel a deep empathy for this stranger, a man who had once been in love, who had once had dreams similar to his own. The more Leo learned about Richard, the more he saw reflections of himself. Both men had been shaped by the city, had been driven by ambition and the desire to escape their pasts. But where Richard had succeeded, Leo had stumbled, losing himself along the way. The note had become a bridge between their two lives, connecting them in ways they couldn't yet fully grasp. Leo began to wonder if, by helping Richard, he might also find a way to help himself, to reclaim the parts of his life he had lost. The journey was no longer just about delivering a message. It was about finding redemption for both himself and the man who had discarded the coat. As Leo's journey neared its end, he felt a sense of anticipation building within him. He was close to finding Richard, close to delivering the note that had set him on this path. But with that anticipation came fear. Fear of what he might find, fear of how this journey would end. The city, which had once seemed so indifferent, now felt alive with possibilities, with the potential for change. Leo knew that whatever happened next, his life would never be the same. The coat, which had started as a simple gift, had become the catalyst for a transformation he hadn't seen coming. Leo's determination led him to the doors of an imposing office building in the heart of the city. He had finally tracked down Richard Hawthorne, the man who had once owned the coat and who, unknowingly, had set Leo on this path of discovery. As he stood outside, nerves tightened in his chest, and for a moment, he hesitated. What would he say? How would Richard react? But there was no turning back now. The note in his pocket felt heavier than ever, as if it were urging him forward. Taking a deep breath, Leo pushed open the glass doors and walked inside. Richard was in the middle of reviewing a contract when his secretary buzzed in, informing him that a young man was here to see him, someone named Leo, who claimed it was urgent. Richard's brow furrowed in confusion. He couldn't recall anyone by that name. Reluctantly, he agreed to the meeting, curious but cautious. When Leo entered the office, the contrast between the two men was stark. Richard, with his polished appearance and aura of authority, and Leo, with his worn coat and weary eyes. But it was the coat that immediately caught Richard's attention, sending a jolt of recognition through him. For a moment, neither man spoke, the weight of the moment hanging heavy in the air. Richard's eyes were fixed on the coat, his mind racing as he tried to piece together why this stranger was wearing something he had discarded. Leo, sensing the tension, reached into his pocket and carefully pulled out the note. He held it out to Richard, his hand steady despite the turmoil churning inside him. "I found this in the lining of the coat," Leo said quietly, his voice betraying the significance of what he was about to reveal. "I thought you might want it back." Richard took the note with a trembling hand, his eyes widening as he recognized the familiar handwriting. It was like being transported back in time, to a younger version of himself who had once believed in love and promises. As he unfolded the paper, memories flooded back. Memories of a woman he had loved deeply, and of the promises they had made to each other. His heart ached as he read the words he had long forgotten, but which now seemed to pulse with life once more. The room around him faded as he was consumed by the emotions he had buried for so long. Leo watched as Richard's expression changed, the initial confusion giving way to a mix of nostalgia and sorrow. It was clear that the note had struck a deep chord within him, awakening feelings that had lain dormant for years. Richard looked up, meeting Leo's gaze with a vulnerability that was startling in its intensity. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Leo explained how he had discovered the note, hidden in the coat, and how it had compelled him to seek out the man who had once owned it. The connection between them, once tenuous, now felt solid, as if fate had indeed brought them together. As Richard absorbed the weight of the note and the memories it unearthed, a storm of emotions raged within him: regret, sadness, and a deep sense of loss. The note was a reminder of a promise he had failed to keep, of a love that had slipped through his fingers as he pursued his ambitions. The man he had become, successful yet hollow, was a far cry from the man who had once written those words. The encounter with Leo had brought all of this to the surface, forcing Richard to confront the choices he had made and the life he had built on the foundations of those choices. For Leo, witnessing Richard's emotional turmoil was both unsettling and enlightening. He had come to deliver the note, to fulfill what he saw as a duty, but he hadn't expected to see such a raw reaction. It made him realize that the man before him was not just a symbol of wealth and power, but a person who had experienced love, loss, and regret just as he had. The boundaries between their lives, once so clear, began to blur. Leo found himself empathizing with Richard in a way he hadn't anticipated, seeing in him a reflection of his own struggles and desires. Richard sat back in his chair, the note clutched tightly in his hand. The silence between the two men was heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Richard broke the silence, his voice tinged with the weight of his emotions. "Thank you," he said simply, though the words carried a depth of meaning that went beyond mere gratitude. It was a thank you for more than just the note. It was for the reminder of who he had been, and perhaps who he could still be. Leo nodded, understanding that this moment was about more than just returning a lost message. It was about bringing a piece of the past into the present. The encounter left both men changed. Richard, who had always prided himself on his composure and control, felt a crack in the facade he had maintained for so long. The note had opened a door to a part of his life he had locked away, and now that it was open, he couldn't ignore what lay beyond. Leo, on the other hand, felt a strange sense of closure, as if his journey had been about more than just finding Richard. It had been about finding a connection, about understanding that even the smallest actions, like discarding an old coat, could ripple out and affect the lives of others in profound ways. As Leo prepared to leave, Richard looked at him with a newfound respect, seeing in him a kindred spirit. I don't know what to say, Richard admitted, the words coming slowly as he grappled with the emotions swirling within him. But I think this is something I needed, even if I didn't realize it. Leo smiled faintly, understanding that sometimes the most important journeys are the ones we don't plan for. With a final nod, he turned to leave, knowing that the encounter had changed them both in ways that neither could fully comprehend at that moment. After the intense encounter in Richard's office, the two men found themselves sitting in silence, the air thick with unspoken thoughts. Richard, still holding the note, felt a rush of memories overwhelming him, memories he had long tried to forget. Leo watched him closely, sensing that something significant was about to be revealed. Richard's grip on the note tightened as he finally looked up at Leo, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and vulnerability. "There's something you should know," Richard began, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "This note, it wasn't just a message. It was a promise I made, one that I never kept." Leo leaned in slightly, his curiosity piqued by Richard's words. The note had already revealed a glimpse of the past, but now it seemed there was more to the story, something deeper, more personal. Richard continued, his gaze distant as he recounted the tale of a love that had once defined his life. He spoke of a woman named Emily, who had been his first love, and how they had planned a future together, filled with dreams and promises. The note, he explained, was written on the day he had promised her they would always be together, no matter what. But life, as it often does, had other plans. As Richard delved deeper into the story, Leo could see the regret etched on his face, the sorrow of a man who had lost something precious in the pursuit of other things. Richard described how his ambition had driven him to prioritize his career over everything else, including his relationship with Emily. As opportunities for success grew, the distance between them widened, until one day, Emily was gone, slipped away like sand through his fingers. The note was the last tangible connection he had to her, a reminder of a time when he had believed that love could conquer all. But now, it was a relic of a past he could never reclaim. Leo listened intently, his own emotions stirred by Richard's confession. The story resonated with him in ways he hadn't expected, echoing the losses and missed opportunities in his own life. He realized that the note had been a turning point for Richard, a moment when he had chosen a path that led him away from what truly mattered. Leo couldn't help but think about the choices he had made, the people he had left behind, and the dreams he had abandoned along the way. The revelation of Richard's truth felt like a mirror, reflecting back the unresolved questions and regrets that Leo had tried to bury. The room seemed to shrink as Richard finished his story, the weight of his words hanging in the air. He looked at Leo, his expression one of quiet desperation. "I never found her again," Richard admitted, the pain of that realization evident in his voice. "I've searched for years, but it was like she vanished without a trace. And now, all I have left is this note and the memory of what could have been." Leo felt a lump form in his throat as he absorbed the gravity of Richard's loss. The note, which had once been a simple message of love, had become a symbol of everything Richard had sacrificed in his pursuit of success. For a moment, neither man spoke, each lost in his own thoughts. But then, Leo felt a surge of determination. He couldn't change the past for Richard, but perhaps there was something he could do to help him find closure. "Maybe it's not too late," Leo suggested, his voice soft but resolute. "Maybe there's still a way to find her, to make things right." Richard looked at him with a mixture of hope and doubt, the possibility of redemption flickering in his eyes. It was a long shot, they both knew that, but the idea of rekindling that lost connection, of fulfilling the promise made so long ago, was too powerful to ignore. Richard nodded slowly, a glimmer of resolve beginning to take shape. "You're right," he agreed, his voice gaining strength. I can't undo the past, but maybe I can find a way to honor that promise now. The decision was made in that moment. Richard would use every resource at his disposal to find Emily, to reconnect with the love he had lost. And Leo, sensing the importance of this journey not just for Richard but for himself as well, offered to help. It was an unlikely partnership, born out of chance and circumstance, but one that felt right, as if it had been destined from the start. The two men, united by a shared purpose, began to discuss their plan. Richard, with his wealth and connections, would launch a search for Emily, while Leo would use his street smarts and determination to follow any leads that emerged. It was a daunting task, but both men felt a renewed sense of purpose, a belief that this was something they were meant to do. The truth that Richard had revealed, the deep regret and longing for a love lost, had not only changed him but had also given Leo a new perspective on his own life. The journey ahead would be challenging, but it was one they were ready to face together. As they prepared to part ways, Richard reached out to shake Leo's hand, a gesture of gratitude and respect. "Thank you," Richard said sincerely, his voice filled with emotion, "for bringing this to me and for helping me see what I need to do." Leo nodded, feeling a sense of camaraderie with the man who had once seemed so distant and unreachable. The note had brought them together, and now it was leading them on a path of redemption and discovery, one that would change both of their lives forever. Richard wasted no time in setting the wheels in motion. Armed with the determination to make things right, he used every resource at his disposal to track down Emily. He enlisted the help of private investigators, combed through old records, and reached out to anyone who might have known her. Days turned into weeks, but Richard's resolve never wavered. Leo, true to his word, also did his part, searching the streets, talking to people who lived in the neighborhoods where Emily might have been. The task was daunting, but both men felt a sense of purpose driving them forward. As the search intensified, Richard found himself reflecting more and more on the choices he had made in his life. The note had become a symbol of everything he had lost, but also of what he still had the power to change. It was as if each step he took in the search for Emily was also a step toward reclaiming a part of himself that he had buried under layers of ambition and success. The process was not without its frustrations. Dead ends and false leads were common, but each setback only strengthened his determination. Richard knew that this was his chance to make amends, not just to Emily, but to the man he had once been. Leo, too, was undergoing a transformation. The journey had forced him to confront his own past, to acknowledge the mistakes he had made and the people he had hurt along the way. As he and Richard delved deeper into the search, Leo began to see parallels between their lives. Both had been driven by ambition, both had lost sight of what truly mattered, and now, both were seeking redemption. The bond between the two men grew stronger with each passing day, their shared mission creating a connection that transcended their differences. Leo found himself opening up to Richard, sharing stories of his own struggles and regrets, finding comfort in the fact that he was not alone in his journey. Finally, after weeks of relentless searching, a breakthrough came. One of the private investigators Richard had hired found a lead. A woman matching Emily's description had been living in a small town a few hours away from the city. She had kept a low profile, working in a local bookstore, and had no known family or connections. The news sent a jolt of excitement through Richard, but also a wave of anxiety. What if she didn't want to see him? What if the years had changed her too much? Or worse, what if she had moved on completely? The questions gnawed at him, but he knew he had to see this through. With Leo by his side, Richard made the journey to the small town. The drive was filled with nervous anticipation, the silence between them heavy with unspoken fears and hopes. As they approached the town, Richard's heart raced. This was it, the moment he had been working toward for so long. The town itself was quaint and unassuming, a stark contrast to the bustling city they had left behind. Richard parked the car outside the bookstore, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. For a moment, he couldn't move, the weight of what he was about to do pressing down on him. Leo, sensing Richard's hesitation, placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You've come this far," Leo said quietly, his voice steady. "Whatever happens, you'll know you tried." Richard nodded, drawing strength from Leo's words. With a deep breath, he pushed open the car door and stepped out, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him. The walk to the bookstore felt like the longest of his life, each step bringing him closer to the confrontation with his past. When he reached the door, he paused, his hand hovering over the handle, as if the act of opening it would somehow alter the course of his life forever. Inside the bookstore, the air was filled with the scent of old paper and the soft murmur of classical music playing in the background. Richard's eyes scanned the room, his heart pounding in his chest, and then he saw her. Emily, standing behind the counter, her hair a little grayer, her face marked by the passage of time, but unmistakably the woman he had once loved. For a moment, Richard couldn't breathe, the sight of her bringing a rush of emotions that he hadn't felt in years. Emily looked up, their eyes meeting across the room, and in that instant, Richard knew that this was the moment he had been waiting for. The bookstore fell into a hush as Richard slowly walked toward the counter, his gaze never leaving Emily's. She looked at him with a mixture of surprise and recognition, her eyes widening as she realized who he was. "Richard," she whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. He nodded, unable to find the words he needed, his emotions too raw to be expressed in that moment. Emily's eyes flickered with 1,000 questions, but Richard could see that beneath the surprise, there was a glimmer of something else, perhaps the same longing that had driven him to find her. Richard took a deep breath, the note still in his pocket, and began to speak. "I know it's been a long time," he started, his voice trembling slightly, "but I never forgot you, Emily. I know I made mistakes, and I know I can't change the past, but I wanted to see you, to tell you that I'm sorry for everything." Emily listened, her expression softening as he spoke. The years had changed them both, but in that moment, they were the same two people who had once dreamed of a future together. Richard reached into his pocket, pulling out the note that had started it all, and handed it to her. "I found this," he said simply. "It reminded me of the promise I made to you, one that I want to keep, even now." Emily took the note, her hands shaking as she unfolded it. The words, though familiar, carried a new weight, a sense of closure that she hadn't realized she needed. Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked back at Richard, the man who had once meant everything to her. "I never thought I'd see you again," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I'm glad you came." In that moment, the years of separation, the pain of lost love, seemed to melt away, replaced by a sense of peace and understanding. Richard and Emily stood there, the note between them, both knowing that this was not just an ending, but a new beginning. The days that followed Richard and Emily's reunion were filled with quiet reflection and deep conversation. The years apart had changed them both, but the connection they once shared remained, like an ember that had never fully extinguished. Richard spent time getting to know Emily again, learning about the life she had built in the small town, the challenges she had faced, and the ways she had found peace. For Emily, seeing Richard again brought back memories of their shared past, but also a sense of closure. The pain of their separation had faded over time, but the feelings of love and loss were still there, lingering beneath the surface. Leo, who had been instrumental in bringing them together, found himself stepping back, allowing Richard and Emily the space they needed to reconnect. He returned to the city, but the experience had left a profound impact on him. The journey had been about more than just finding Emily. It had been about understanding the value of the unexpected, the moments and decisions that seem insignificant but end up shaping our lives in ways we could never have anticipated. Leo realized that the coat, the note, and the mission he had taken on had all been part of a larger plan, one that had changed not only Richard's life but his own as well. As Richard and Emily spent more time together, they both began to see the possibilities that lay ahead. The note, which had once symbolized a broken promise, now represented a second chance, an opportunity to rebuild what had been lost. They knew they couldn't simply pick up where they had left off, but they could start anew, with the wisdom that comes from years of life and experience. Richard, who had spent so much of his life chasing success, now understood that true fulfillment came from the connections we make and the promises we keep. Emily, who had found her own way in the world, welcomed the chance to explore this new chapter with Richard, with the knowledge that they had both grown and changed. For Leo, the experience was a turning point. He had started the journey as a man adrift, searching for meaning in a world that often felt cold and indifferent. But through his involvement in Richard and Emily's story, he had found a renewed sense of purpose. The note, which had seemed like a small, insignificant piece of paper, had transformed his life, giving him the strength to confront his own past and make amends where he could. The journey had taught him that even the smallest actions, like picking up an old coat, can lead to unexpected and life-changing outcomes. Richard and Emily decided to take things slowly, understanding that rebuilding their relationship would take time and patience. But they were both committed to the process, knowing that they had been given a rare gift, a second chance at love, at redemption, at finding peace. Richard no longer felt the need to prove himself through material success. Instead, he focused on nurturing the relationships that truly mattered, starting with Emily. The note, once a symbol of regret, now sat in a frame on Emily's bookshelf, a reminder of the journey that had brought them back together and the value of the promises we make, no matter how much time has passed. As the months went by, Leo found himself thinking often about Richard and Emily, wondering how their story would unfold. He knew that he had played a small but significant role in their reunion, and that knowledge brought him a sense of satisfaction. The experience had also inspired him to take a closer look at his own life, to find ways to reconnect with the people he had lost touch with, and to make amends where he could. Leo understood now that life is full of unexpected twists and turns, and that sometimes the most meaningful moments come from the things we least expect. One evening, as Leo walked through the city streets, he found himself reflecting on the journey that had begun with a simple coat. The city, once a place of hardship and struggle, now felt different to him. A place where anything was possible, where even the smallest actions could lead to profound change. He realized that the coat and the note hidden within it had not only brought Richard and Emily back together, but had also given him a new perspective on life. Leo knew that he was no longer the man he had been when he first found the coat. He had changed, grown, and found a sense of purpose he had long thought lost. Richard, too, felt the changes within himself. The reunion with Emily had given him a chance to reflect on the choices he had made, to understand what truly mattered in life. The coat, which had once been a discarded relic of his past, had brought him full circle, reconnecting him with the love and the values he had once cherished. As he and Emily continued to rebuild their relationship, Richard knew that he was no longer driven by the same ambitions that had once consumed him. Instead, he was focused on living a life that was rich in meaning, in love, and in the connections that make life worth living. The story of the coat, the note, and the journey that had brought Richard, Emily, and Leo together was one of unexpected twists and turns, of second chances and redemption. It was a reminder that life is full of surprises, and that sometimes the things we discard without a second thought can come back to us in ways we never imagined. As Richard, Emily, and Leo each moved forward in their lives, they carried with them the lessons they had learned, that love, forgiveness, and the willingness to take a chance on the unexpected can lead to the most profound and meaningful changes.